Today is February 1st, 2021. I am Cameron Wood here at the Ohio History Connection. I'm talking with Viola Pagliaro and Nick Stellanova today, and we'll talk about their experiences in the LGBTQ community. Nick and Viola, can you please share when and where you were born in Ohio?
I'll go first. I was born August 21st, 1997 in Columbus, Ohio.
And I was born September 17th, 1998 in Beechwood, Ohio.
Thank you. We're going to start with your kind of coming out stories. And so, Viola, I guess we'll start with you, and kind of, Nick, you can kind of weave in however you feel like that works.
Sure. So I went through a bit of a tumultuous time near the end of 2016. I think I must have been a sophomore in college at that point. And I was struggling pretty severely with depression. I had been diagnosed with depression at a very young age. I think I actually started medication for it as young as 6 or 7. And this was just sort of the worst experience I had had. I don't know if sort of the reality of adult life or college or anything sort of set in, but I remember at one point I would tell people that it felt like my brain was static and my body was moving through molasses, just doing day to day, getting out of bed, walking somewhere, across a room even. And eventually I admitted myself to the hospital because I thought at the time, and I agree with this now, that I needed some relative intervention to try to get things in order. In the hospital, I guess, a really empowering thought sort of occurred to me during recovery, and it was this idea that, if I couldn't live with myself as I was, if, I had all this self-directed anger, frustration, I had full autonomy to decide for myself who I wanted to be. And that pretty much being synonymous with someone's true nature, I believe, I decided to try and work towards carving out this new identity for myself, this new, more authentic one. And a few months later found me meeting some trans folks in our community. I was back at Capital University, and our Pride organization was hosting a panel where trans folk from the community would come and speak about their lived experience. And I had always sort of known about trans identities in general. Obviously, I didn't really have a lot of exposure prior to Laverne Cox, really, and Orange is the New Black, or other celebrities who have since come out. So hearing, what this experience is like, what transition was like, and what was possible with it, completely threw me for a loop. I didn't think anything like that was possible. So I ended up speaking to one of the panelists afterwards and, sort of just talking things through, because I was like, I'm scared. Am I supposed to be scared about this possibility that I might be trans? And since then, I went to my therapist. I went to a local healthcare organization that specializes in LGBTQ plus health and healthcare. And in May of 2017, I started HRT, and I guess that's really where things took off.
Can you explain HRT?
Oh, HRT is an acronym for hormone replacement therapy. People who are trans sometimes opt to take estrogen or testosterone in order to change the body, I guess, to match more consistently with one's sense of self and their own gender identity.
And so, so this all started with you going into the hospital, or did you feel like there was inklings of something before that?
I think it's very easy in retrospect to say, oh, there was this sign, and this sign, and not everyone even necessarily will show signs earlier on. But for starters, in childhood, I never really met the standards that were set for masculinity. And there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with masculinity, I'll be the first to say that. But it didn't really match me, and any attempts I had made to sort of fit that mold never really worked out. I felt most comfortable in environments and situations that didn't call for me expressing that masculinity. So I guess that's a earlier sign.
And so you started working for, well, you started interning for, was it around the same time early on, or?
Yeah, so I sought out an internship with that same LGBTQ healthcare provider. I want to say late 2017, I had volunteered for one of their annual conferences. And I wormed my way in from there into an internship and was able to start that early 2018. I've been there since, whether it be an internship status, a volunteer, and now full-time.
And Nick, where are you kind of at in this timeline of?
Well, I met Vi in November, December of 2017. I know we met around that time. And when she started her internship, I remember being there for that and being really excited for her. And I also use the same provider for hormone replacement therapy. I started in November of 2019 is when I started hormone replacement therapy. And I don't know, I've been tangentially related to the work through Vi. I've done work for the same organization, and I just really like what is being done in the community right now.
Vi, what is your, how does your work take you out in the community, and what do you do with that?
Sure. So my work, for starters, it on the outside it appears sort of like a standard logistical desk job, but it's sort of more about the team dynamic in education around LGBTQ plus identities. And we take a multi-pronged approach to that through educating providers and through educating the community. So, for example, my organization would go out and train, say, a healthcare provider or really any business seeking to serve the community, and talk to them about like best practices for serving these communities or being inclusive. We'll also, upon request, sort of take an inventory and assess their physical spaces, their policy, etc., in order to give them pointers on how to make this as a welcoming and accessible of an environment as they can for these communities. And then, of course, there's also the idea of like community empowerment in regards to knowing one's own rights when they, for example, seek out health care. And also just enabling them to assert themselves and those rights in the settings that, we cover.
There's also the legal name change clinics that
that's right.
are put on. Those are really helpful, I think, because there's a lot of red tape surrounding changing your name as a trans person. It is very daunting, and Vi was in charge of doing a lot of the prep work and the follow-through for these clinics that were held that would basically walk you through the steps and help you file the paperwork of changing your name legally.
And gender marker, which
And
has even
gender
more red
marker.
tape.
Yes.
Yeah, I did that for a short period of time. At one point, I was working 2 part-time jobs for this organization, and that was one of them, where we would have these in-person legal clinics in order to sort of walk trans people through the process of changing their name or gender marker, both on the state level and federal level where applicable. Granted, I believe that Ohio is just allowed for gender marker change on birth certificates, but while I was working this position, that was not possible. There were tons of loopholes involved with getting it changed with your federal passport, but not your birth certificate. So you could offer that as a secondary form of ID without outing yourself as a transgender individual.
So what's the difficulty with getting your name changed and your gender marker changed in Ohio specifically? Or are there requirements that are kind of difficult to?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. There's a lot of bureaucracy surrounding it, as you can imagine, and some level of that is necessary. Go ahead.
There's also a financial strain that it puts on you between application fees, and you also have to publish a notice of name change in a newspaper, which is potentially outing you basically to whoever reads the newspaper. And I know it's not likely that people will do that anymore, but that it feels really scary to put yourself out there like that and to also go into court and have to declare why you're changing your name in front of a bunch of different people, most of whom don't know you, don't know why you're there. It's just,
yeah,
there's a lot of barriers.
There's a lot of things both on a technical level and for a personal level why this might be difficult for some people. Some folks may want to just sort of quietly change their name and not have to jump through all these hoops or blast to the world that they're changing their name. There's also the fact that gender markers are even more of a difficulty to change. BMV, for example, you have to fill out a form to request that they mail you another form that then you have to mail back in. Then they'll send you a certificate that you take to the BMV, and then they print off your new ID. And that was difficult. I remember going into the BMV earlier on in this process, misunderstanding some of the directions, and a gentleman behind the desk, he very loudly answered my question to this very packed BMV, and that was not a pleasant experience either. But after going through all these processes, it doesn't really end on this sort of administrative level. You also have to change this with your bank, with insurance. If you go to any doctor's office, even as like a dermatology clinic or something, for example, you got to change your name there. And needless to say, that creates a lot of confusion and may even in some circumstances raise red flags surrounding things like insurance fraud or, banks might, if they don't have all the information they need right away, it might raise a red flag there as well.
Nick, you mentioned that your work is on comics and art.
Yeah.
That works in the transgender community. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I graduated from art school this past year, 2020. Not a great time to graduate, first of all. But I obtained a degree in comics and narrative practice, and I've been using my work to try and kind of show a different side of my life that I don't show to a lot of people. I really like focusing in on transgender narratives and LGBTQ themes because that's so close to my life. I don't know. I'm working on several comics that feature trans characters. A lot of them are very personal to me. A lot of them are autobiographical. And I'm working on getting some of them published. So there is a strong possibility that these will be able to be bought soon, I hope. COVID depending. But I want to show people that beyond the narratives that they see of trans people portrayed by cis people or people who are not trans, that there are so many layers and multitudes within trans people. We are just as varied as those who are not trans or LGBTQ. I'd like to show a softer side, a less harsh side of the often portrayed terrible things happening to trans and queer people in media. I want to show what I think is possible.
What do you think is the most, what do you notice most about maybe something you feel is not maybe completely accurate when a cisgender person portrays a transgender person in like movies and television?
It's not necessarily the accuracy that I'm concerned about. It's more of, it feels very one note what we see in media. Like, I feel like most of the transgender stories, specifically, or LGBT stories, I see in popular media is based on poking fun at these people or tragedy. There's not a whole lot of laughing with them or comedy or romance that isn't ended abruptly and sadly. I think that definitely has a place, but when it's all you're seeing from people who aren't trans or LGBTQ themselves, it kind of makes you think like, well, is this all you think of me? Do you only think I'm capable of tragedy or a sick joke? And I'd like to, and a lot of trans creatives and LGBT creatives right now are pushing that and making it harder for it to be a one-note representation. And I think we're headed in a great trajectory, but I'd like to do my part in that and just kind of show different sides of things because multifaceted.
Yeah. Do you think there's a difference in representation when the person maybe creating or acting is of an older generation as opposed to a younger generation?
In general, probably, yeah. I would say so, just because generational differences are real, and I think it's important to recognize that the stories of the past are not necessarily wrong or can be ignored, even if they feel in this day and age outdated or offensive in some ways. It's important to take from them what you can. And the older generations that are being portrayed sometimes don't get the limelight they deserve, I think. And while there's more representation now, we need to represent, I think, people of all ages, all genders, all sexualities, all races, religions, etc. Of any age. It's just...
Kind of a general question. How have you both, being younger people, found the LGBT community in Columbus to be?
Would you like me to go first, or would you?
You can go first.
Okay. There's sort of multiple parts to that question, I guess. The first sort of being access. There's, that when you first sort of come out, at least for many people, it can be really invigorating to realize there's a whole community rich with history and activism who, in every sense of the word, could and often would fight for you should you face like an injustice regarding that identity. And that's incredibly empowering. As I have, I guess, tried to explore these communities, I think it is important to acknowledge that they are not always without fault, particularly with younger members of our community. And honestly, it's not all young people, of course, but there's a lot of sort of infighting regarding some more specific, nuanced ideas of identity and what it does and doesn't mean. And granted, I think there's definitely a time and place for those discussions. I think sometimes it does serve to distract us from a more common goal. If we, I guess, are, being so harsh to one another in certain settings, within our own community, within our own family, so to speak, it's I think can interfere with our effectiveness of, speaking out for things like rights for non-discrimination. And there's definitely a large sect of the community who, once I think in 2016 we received marriage equality, said, Yahoo, we did it. Now let's go party and not worry about the human rights implications anymore. And there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think when people begin to lose sight of that, we are still in this sort of fight or flight mode. And we look for any opportunity to argue. And it comes from a trauma response, I think, a sort of shared community difficulties. But overall, I think it's important to just sort of keep that perspective in mind, because there's a lot we can accomplish if we organize and work together. Yeah.
I think coming to Columbus for school, it was just like, I grew up in a very rural area. The LGBTQ community was not very present where I grew up. I had some close friends that were of that community, but once I arrived here, I was like, wow, there are so many LGBTQ people here. I can choose which communities I belong to. Finally, it wasn't like, well, we have to all stick together because we're queer or trans. I can safely say that I can meet queer or trans people here and decide whether or not I want to be affiliated with them. I think, like any community, Columbus's LGBTQ community has its pros and cons, ups and downs. I'm happy to be a part of it. I'm happy to be an active part of it when I can be, but that doesn't mean I agree with everything that happens, like with certain pride events that were interrupted by unjust policing, to new pride events that are focused on community organization and people of color. I think that's very important, and that's what I'd like to spend my time with, not necessarily the community as a whole is hard to see as a whole when there's so much, and I think that's amazing.
What do you think what was your entry point to the community in Columbus for each of you?
I think for me, before I was out as trans, I was out as a lesbian, and I knew that right when I got into Columbus. I wanted to join my school's pride organization and see what that was all about. And that was kind of my entry to the community. I was introduced to many events. I went to my first Columbus Pride, I think, with you in 2018, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right.
I think that's where, or was it yeah, it was 2018.
Yeah, it would have
we
been.
went to two community prides.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just the art there, the music, the people. It was all so wonderful that I was like, wow, I think that I have found like my part of the community, kind of.
And Vi, was your first with your work, or the organization that you started working with now, or was that some other way in?
Sure. So even though I didn't come out as transgender until 2017, excuse me, from high school, I think, earliest on, I had a lot of friends and friends of friends who were members of the community and were out at the time even. And so I would join them as an ally to our school's GSA. At the time, that was Gay Straight Alliance, but I think now they've shifted to Gender and Sexuality Alliance, which I think is excellent. And in high school, that was a very laid-back sort of community space. We sometimes had presentations or activities relating to the community, but overall it was more of like a social circle. And then I continued to attend similar clubs and activities when I went to college. And just because of the vast differences in everyone's I guess, childhoods and upbringing that sort of expanded upon what I had started in high school. And since then, a lot of mine runs parallel to Nick's because we've spent a lot of that time together since.
So, how much do you feel like of the community, is there a big online component to getting into the community, do you think, as you were kind of coming into it, or do you feel like it exists 50-50 or?
I didn't really notice there. Of course, people have advertised online on social media platforms of things happening. There is communication over online platforms, but most of the community events that I've been a part of, most of the things that I've done in the community have been through word of mouth or going to meetings, or it's been a lot more in person, I think, than a lot of. But then again, I don't have a lot of online communities that overlap with the. I don't socialize a lot online. I spend a lot of time online not socializing.
From what I have experienced, there's, again, two parts to this. The first being local versus just sort of the larger miasmic online community. Starting local, you have organizations like Be Quick, like Trans Ohio, Stonewall, Kaleidoscope Youth Center, etc. And they generally do a pretty good job about spreading the word about in-person local community events geared towards the LGBTQ plus community. And apart from sort of getting that messaging out there, a lot of the actual communication, in my experience, happens on a more personal level, whether that's in person or through direct interactions. I would like to say regarding the more miasmic internet community, there's a lot of pros and cons there, obviously. You have access to a wider array of experiences and people's stories, but you also have a wider array of people trying to take you down a notch, whether emotionally or otherwise. But I think it's a valuable asset for someone just coming into their identity. Granted that there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of generally agreed upon as helpful things to share with people who are just coming out. But after a while, I think it's important to sort of realize that you are not required to inhabit that online space forever, especially if you don't want to. I think it's valuable to accept it and be thankful for the information you found, but there's no need to stay there any longer. There are communities where people compare each other's transition progress, for example. That, while granted, can be affirming for some people to see as a sort of potential future they could look at as saying this is possible for trans people, it can eventually become obsessive, and people can begin to think that because I'm not doing X, Y, and Z, I am not doing something right. So I think it's important to sort of take a lot of the information found there with a grain of salt.
And I think that what you're saying then is, like, especially in Columbus, you don't have to be on the online community to be an active member of the community.
Mm-hmm.
It's honestly more in person than online in my experience, but that's just my experience also.
And I don't think you necessarily even have to assemble with a particular named group in order to be an active member of a greater community. You can act as an individual, and I think it's important now more than ever, really, to remember our individuality and our own identities as a component of, but not necessarily as the same as our identity. Otherwise, it's very easy to get swept into sort of crowd mentalities, and not necessarily always in a bad way, but it's important to think for oneself and remain critical of things you take for granted.
Nick, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting. You mentioned that a group you belonged to was originally called the Gay Straight Alliance.
Oh, that was me, yeah.
Viola. And they changed their name to Gender and
Sexuality Alliance.
Have you, both of you, noticed like broadening even just in the short kind of time that you've been part of the LGBT community, noticed like that shift from to be more inclusive to a broader idea of gender identities?
I'd say so. For instance, LGBT became more apparent after just then saying many people in my younger life circles would say things like the gays or the gay community or the lesbian community. Sort of, even though the term itself isn't particularly new, its usage has entered the general vernacular and has expanded from LGBT to add the Q and the plus. And then there's also the, I guess, for lack of a better word, newer, updated, whatever you want to call it, pride flag that has black and brown as well as the trans pride colors in it to sort of symbolize inclusion under one family. And I think that's an excellent start to a hopefully greater trend of widening inclusion.
So Nick, you met Viola through the LGBT community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we actually met on a specifically, it was marketed as a lesbian dating site. That's kind of where we first met and started talking and eventually met up. But I think that because of the LGBT community in the area, after so many failed interactions and chance meetings and whatnot, I think that being a part of the lesbian community was very helpful for me at the time. It was the local community and the community on a greater scale helped me meet Vi, who in turn helped me see other parts of the community and eventually come out to myself as trans. So when we met, I was still identifying as a lesbian completely. I was very much a cisgender person, or so I thought at the time. And after like 2 years, I think, I was like, uh-oh. I don't know about this anymore. Kind of feeling where it's like, I think my identity is shifting. And having Vi be Vi was much more active in the community than I was, I feel like, just from the stance of her work to like the people she knew. It was just a different circle than I was used to, and it expanded my circle, so I knew more people suddenly. I was doing more events. I was more able to talk to these people about their experiences, and I gained a wider view of gender and sexuality. And I think just that chance meeting on a dating app marketed towards lesbians, I think that's like a perfect meeting story for us too, because it shows where we both started and where we both ended up, kinda.
Everything changes. I remember finding you on the app and thinking, this like bright person with like a shining smile holding a lesbian flag in what appeared to be a pride march.
I was in the Pride March in Cleveland in 2017, I think was that picture, or maybe it was 2016.
One of them.
One of them. I think it was 2017, but that was my first Pride event, and I was very, very happy, very, very smiley, and had very brightly dyed hair. I went with some friends, and that was my first, I think, real, larger community event. And that's also fitting that that's how you first saw me.
And then I found your Instagram, and there was this picture of you after having eaten what you described as the worst grilled cheese you had ever made. And that's when I knew it had to be love.
That's very cute. But yeah, I think connecting with our community has made us stronger people and a stronger couple also, just for the good things we've seen and the bad things we've seen. Like, whatever we've experienced together has made us stronger, and being a part of the community has definitely made us stronger.
So how has your involvement with the community and organizations changed as we've moved into 2020 and kind of had the lockdown and everything? How has that kind of changed the way you interact and even just your work in general?
For the way I operate, it's been rather difficult because I've lost so much of the in-person meeting space, which was very important to me. But I've found also that there are other ways to connect with people. I'm still working on certain comics that will be hopefully published soon that I'm hoping will reach a wider audience than I've been able to reach. During 2020, it's also been, while it's been isolating, it's also kind of been like, well, now we have something to bring us together. We have this shared event in the community that's like, either we work through it now or we celebrate once it's over. Whatever we're doing is kind of bringing us together. It's, at least in my small circle, it's made me closer to the people I was already like sharing a living space with, at least. Like, I think it's strengthened some community bonds for me. It's also strained others because of just the sheer volume of terrifying things going on. There's been so much anxiety and like heartbreak in the community, but there's also been very small victories that have helped us keep going, I think.
So the question was how 2020 and lockdown has sort of shifted the scope of the work.
Yeah, I feel like even that is not giving 2020 enough credit in some ways, because it's like, yes, there's the pandemic, but then there's everything, the political and everything else.
I think you
goes
can
with
speak
2020.
more to that.
Yeah.
Your work has been affected a lot more.
Yeah, so speaking from a broader sense and narrowing down to the details in a moment, lockdown has really physically forced a lot of people into more confined spaces with, going out and doing errands is sort of like going out and gathering resources, then coming home to hunker down. And at first it was a very jarring shift, and now it has become sort of a day-to-day drudging on of the same old every single day. But what that does is force us to seek connection, stimuli, etc., in digital spaces. And that has, from what I can tell, really ramped up the speed of media, realizing, how much more time the general population is spending online. It means they will try to do whatever they can to get the clicks. Hence the severe spike in an age of misinformation. Things get passed around as fact without appropriate checks in place, and suddenly you have large fractions of the global population with a separate view on reality and what is truth than the rest. So a shift to this digital space, while granted can bring many people closer together, it also sort of increases the transmission rate, so to speak, of misinformation in this digital space. Shifting down to a smaller scale and how that's impacted me, my workplace, and our work in general, we would deliver trainings as like in-person presentations. And I honestly, I'd been arguing for a while that we should start looking at webinar delivery, but COVID-19 necessitated that, and I think we were fortunate enough to shift to virtual delivery and get that infrastructure set up really early on in lockdown, realizing that, regardless of the length of this lockdown, we need to still continue doing the work we do. It's very important. And so we've shifted to this digital work from home space since, and done honestly incredibly well. Regarding issues this might create for the community, there are a lot of health disparities facing the LGBTQ community, and that's why my organization does what it does. That said, people being, by necessity needing to stay in their own homes, our community members, for example, who disproportionately suffer from domestic abuse and violence, may very well now be sort of in captivity with their abusers. And that can create a number of very specific new difficulties. Of course, there's also telemedicine and how that affects the community. On one hand, you have a lot of providers who need to learn about best practices surrounding like name and pronoun usage for trans people, not making assumptions about sexuality or gender, but also for many of the community who disproportionately suffer mental illness such as like ADHD or anxiety, the shift to virtual has been helpful for many. Someone doesn't realize they have an appointment until 5 minutes before. They can just pop on their phone and join the call like nothing happened. They don't have to go out to schedule or make an appointment. So some pharmacies are now delivering medications. And if that gets more people access to care, regardless of where they live or who they are, what they're dealing with, I think that's a positive change that I hope would remain past the scope of COVID-19.
I think also something that is worth saying, though, is that especially in rural communities in Ohio, virtual visits are not a possibility. Just based on the internet coverage, I had, when I was growing up, friends down the road who couldn't get internet, and they didn't get internet until like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's not good enough to hold a video call. They're basically locked out of those kind of virtual visits or medicine deliveries, because a lot of places in rural communities do not deliver that kind of thing. When it's a struggle to get Amazon to come to your house, then I don't think that the pharmacy is going to be much help either. So especially like all issues, there's multiple approaches and multiple problems, and what works for some may not work for others. But that's just something I felt like was worth mentioning, that especially in rural communities, this is not the same thing. And this is not the same pandemic for us that it is for someone who lives where I grew up.
Yeah, and I think that sort of points to privilege is really important to keep in mind. From internet accessibility to location to income to race, all those sort of things intersect and very heavily can influence the scope of the damage that COVID can do to someone beyond the health implications.
Do you feel like, Viola, do you feel like your work has done, you said that you switched over pretty well and easily. Do you think you've reached as many people as you would have?
We put on a conference this last year, our annual one, the first one I volunteered for back in the day. And we, my understanding, and I don't have the numbers and probably wouldn't like to share them directly anyway, but we've reached a much larger population of people with a much wider geographic reach. So I think in that sense, the scope of that work is only growing. And especially with other current events such as Biden being sworn in, pledging to sign the Equality Act in the first 100 days of office, re-implementing the Obama-era definition of Title IX, I believe. All of those things play into the need for cultural competency in all these systems, you know, and now that even private organizations are seeing this on the federal level, they'll most likely be more incentivized to seek out the services like the ones we offer. So I think just by nature and by circumstance, we've really, I guess, benefited, but our hope is that the community will also benefit.
I think also the switch to digital access for a lot of these conferences, a lot of these events, has been incredibly helpful for those who are disabled. As someone who has had mobility issues and someone who has known many people who are wheelchair users, this is honestly probably one of the bigger game changers. With a switch to digital aspects of conferences or events, even if they return to in-person, there should still be some kind of digital component to best reach as many members of the communities as possible. I think I have heard many people saying, like, oh, I'm so glad that this is online this year, though, because now I can actually be a part of it.
So it sounds like a lot of that stuff is going to be somewhat permanent, at least.
We can hope. We can hope that there are positive changes from this.
Yeah. So going beyond the pandemic and maybe online, you started to mention the political changes with the Biden administration coming in. What has that meant to you, not just like doing your job, but maybe emotionally as well?
There was a time in which I would have thought that the handoff from our previous administration to what is now the current one would have been, a relief. I can take a breath, things are going to be fine. But in light of recent circumstances, with tensions high, with misinformation at an all-time high, I see the new administration as just straight up being the bare minimum that we can do right now. And on one hand, that's important because if there is anything within our power to try to correct some of the issues that have either rose or come to the limelight in the past 4 years, we ought to take whatever routes possible to do our best, even if it's not perfect. But on the other token, I see how many people, especially in our community, are disillusioned, and understandably so, in that for many, Biden represents a return to quote-unquote normalcy, but normalcy in the sense of everything is going to go back to how it was about 4 years ago, and we're just going to ignore all the other problems that have come to light that maybe have roots earlier than that. And I would agree in that is sort of an irresponsible way to look at things. I think the narrative should instead be focused on positive change rather than back to normalcy, because say what you will, the number of deaths from COVID at an all-time high and transmission rate and everything going forward, like this is going to be a generational trauma that I think anyone who's lived through, even from toddlers to people near end of life, are going to remember in some capacity as a very dark time. And I don't think we're all the way out of it yet, or even necessarily close to being out of it. And so I am trying to remain cautiously optimistic that we can do better, but I'll need to see some progress being made more broadly before I'm willing to accept that maybe we're on our way back up.
And I think this is a good time for us to remember this is one of the first big presidencies of our lives that we're able to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
When my first election was the 2016 election.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first one I was eligible to vote in.
I think so too.
And that was one huge heartbreak. But it also was the start of me learning about the processes and about how, despite everyone's insistence that he wouldn't win, Trump still got elected. And that the only way I think there needs to be more changes, and I think that this 2020 election has shown to me, at least, that even if the person you're rooting for wins, doesn't mean your work is over. You have to keep constant pressure on them so that they do not stray from their ideas.
Or their promises.
And it's important to exercise your rights to vote, of course, and it's your decision of whether or not to vote, but I think bigger changes need to happen than what is currently going on for the community, for all communities. I think that this election may feel like a relief, and it sure can be, because it's a sign that things are changing, but we need to keep pushing to make that change a positive one.
What kind of things, what kind of changes would you like to see? You mentioned, Viola, as Biden kind of being a good step, but the kind of the bare minimum. What kind of changes would you like to see for the future, I guess?
So for starters, I think on a fundamental level, human rights protections in as many of areas as you can fathom would sort of need to take precedence, even before economy, even before more nuanced levels of, I guess, federal action. You need to make sure that you are doing your best to at least have systems in place to account for, accommodate for racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, etc. That means protections on rights, identifying and accommodating for inequities, or sort of, for example, certain communities may not have access to resources that, white rich communities might. And making sure that those resources that are advertised as being for everyone are actually accessible to everyone, and bridging those gaps is an important first step. In addition to that, federal minimum wage, I understand Biden is pushing with the next stimulus package to raise that to $15 an hour. My understanding is that it hasn't been raised considerably for a very long time, and as far as inflation goes, it is not properly scaled. While $15 an hour is great, my concern, as well as the concern of many, is by the time any such thing is implemented, it'll already have inflated to warrant another. And so it's important that things from employment to pay to work opportunities are as equitable as possible across the board, such that our least healthy members of society are much better off than before.
I think that healthcare is a big one. Also, like human rights, especially. And I think the communities that we're a part of, the LGBTQ communities, other communities, etc., I feel like the benefits from this administration need to be pushed a little bit more, based on the fact that something like Trump can happen again. I think the pressure comes from the knowing that this could all be overturned, and we're trying to build a better place to be. We're trying to make America and Ohio a better place for marginalized communities to live. And that can't happen without community support and changes in administration and laws. Especially with police brutality, it just doesn't stop, it seems like. And the more I become aware of it, the more I'm like, well, how do we end this? And I don't know exactly how yet, but I will sure as hell fight very hard for whatever the community deems as important.
Were either of you involved in the Black Lives Matter protests earlier this year?
I attended a march, and forgive me, my time frame is off given the nature of COVID, and this happened during the summer, which was still pretty early on in lockdown. The march I attended was it was a Juneteenth march, and I felt compelled to join in because of a number of reasons. Obviously, not standing for what's happening, but just in the way that many have marched for LGBTQ rights who weren't necessarily members of that community. I felt like it was my sort of moral obligation to show up and be there and be active in this, just as people have shown up for me. And at the time, I had everything I felt in my power. I needed to be safe there. And it was a peaceful march by the time it came to a close. But I believe the protest the very next day, which I had missed due to a former engagement, of course, I believe there were some excessive uses of force by the Columbus police that, needless to say, didn't go over well. And that's still an ongoing battle. We see a lot of that continuing, and my concern is that people showing up the way I did that once, granted, is going to continue to dwindle as people think, what's the point? Nothing's going to change. Once that apathy sets in, once we get acclimated to that constant inundation of violence and brutality, rooted in maybe what people consider our differences, that's not how change happens. People need to stay vigilant and stay strong in their message that we're not going to stand for that.
And I wasn't able to go based on some physical health problems I was having around the same time. And I think the most important thing to do, though, is listen to members of that community, listen to the Black community, listen to the communities with people of color, listen to the people of color within your own communities. And that's what I think is important, and that's what I'm trying to do.
I think that brings up a good point we talked about earlier in regards to the LGBTQ community, is that communities like our community and the Black community are not monoliths. They are not some sort of larger hive mind that all stand for one thing. There is a nuance in every individual and their lived experience that I think is valuable. It's also important to recognize that not everybody who is necessarily a member of a community is a spokesperson for it. Not everyone is going to always have the right things to say at the right time for any number of reasons. And there's a lot of sensationalism around, finding someone who is willing to open their mouth and talk about something and then be taken out of context or misunderstood even. And I think it's important to just recognize that you can't just listen to a single person and think, well, I've made up my mind. That's sort of the idea of saying, oh, I have a gay best friend, I can use this slur whenever I want. That's not how things work. You really have to do a little more digging and research and give a lot of time, energy, and thought into these issues. It's not going to go away by attending a 30-minute webinar, right? You have to do a lot more than that. The webinar, those small exposures are the beginnings, not the solutions.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I said, listen to the community, not person.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think one last thing I guess I wanted to ask you about is we talked about the pandemic, and I wanted to circle back to that, but more as nothing major, but just personally, in your very personal lives at home and just doing your stuff, how has it affected you and how have you adapted to it?
I'll let you go first on that one if you like.
I've been very stir crazy. I don't like being cooped up in the house all the time. I get to leave for work and grocery shopping and small things like that, but I miss being comfortable outside. I miss being able to go to a park and not be terrified all the time of that, soccer mom over there isn't wearing a mask or something. I don't like that I have to think about that now. I've been struggling with work and new jobs and new opportunities that have been greatly dampened by the pandemic. A lot of things that were planned fell away or didn't happen, and of course I'm severely disappointed, but I think this is just something I can get through. But it sucks. It does suck. But I think the friends that we've lived with and the people that we live with, and we're closer to each other, we're just closer to those who we surround ourselves with, though. So that's been nice, but maybe too close. With roommates and such, you know. It's like,
So you're fresh out of college,
Yes.
pretty much, and that must be a real struggle then, just trying to find work and.
finding work was really hard.
Yeah.
Like, who's hiring in a pandemic? Not very many people.
Except for maybe Amazon, who historically hasn't treated their workers very well.
And I'm disabled in some ways physically, so that I can't really do that kind of work anymore. I can't really do hard physical labor anymore.
Regarding sort of home life and experience, there's a lot of things that go hand in hand there, but early on it was at first a shift to adjust to working from home. It is a luxury, but it is, I think, important to remember it's a luxury of times when everything is sort of bad by default, right? So at first it was sort of exciting, you know, I get my home set up, ready to go. I attend Zoom call after Zoom call, video chats, and slowly but surely lines begin to bleed between work life and home life. And the lines continue to bleed between the hours, the days, the months. Everything that has happened really since the lockdown began feels like a sort of miasma of time and suffering.
One really long week.
Yeah, and I could have something for dinner, go to bed, wake up, and I've forgotten what I ate for dinner last night, not sure if it was last night or 4 weeks ago. You know, even things like household chores, like I just did the dishes yesterday, and come to find out I haven't done them in a week. The necessity of sort of keeping record of things, at least in the short term, has become a source of stress. And then in addition to those sort of routines, you sort of also start to direct a lot of these blurred lines inward. A lot of identity, not just from a gender standpoint, but from like a larger picture standpoint, those lines begin to bleed as well, and you are sort of forced to, and I think this is a spur for change, you're sort of forced to consider all the things that you would assume to be true about yourself, about your upbringing, about the world you live in. And it is a slow, very painful disillusionment that really doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. It's sort of a can of worms that's being slowly pried open.
It's been hard. Pandemics are difficult.
Yeah.
Hopefully we only get one every 100 years or so.
So they're also saying COVID might be around to stay in the form of another sort of flu-like thing we'll need vaccines for every year. And if that is the case, I'm not optimistic we'll hit our stride for a couple more years.